Apparently that means go. Cool. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for coming along to Open Source Bristol. I'm Colin Eberhardt. I'm the CTO of Scott Logic, where we're hosting this event. We've got some fantastic talks for you. Before we get started, I've got a few thank yous and a little bit of housekeeping. I'll keep it relatively brief. You don't want to hear me waffling on. So the first is a few thank yous. So thank you to Scott Logic. I guess sounds a bit weird. That's the company I work for. But hey, thank you, Scott Logic. Also, thank you to Finos, who are another one of our sponsors. Quick thank you to Claire and Paul within Scott Logic, who've done a lot of work to organise this event. And of course, thank you to the people that you're going to be hearing speak in just a few minutes. With that in mind, I just want to hand the mic over to James from Finos. So Finos are an organisation that we work quite closely with. They're one of the co-organisers of this event. They're pretty well known in financial services for fostering open source collaboration. So James, do you want to say a few words?
Hi everyone, it's so great to be in Bristol again. It's good to come back down after 2 years being in Brighton due to COVID, and so thank you to Colin and the Scott Logic team and the people at home as well for being out tonight. It's greatly appreciated. So Finos is the Fintech Open Source Foundation. We have an organisation on GitHub, so if you go to github.com/Finos, you'll find a bunch of projects in there and special interest groups that have been contributed by financial services firms and also firms like Scott Logic alike. I'd like to put a brief ad out for all of the swag that various different parties have brought here, especially these pronoun badges, which are absolutely brilliant, right? So thanks to Secure, is it Secure Design? Simply Secure for bringing those. And also for putting them on GitHub, because it's actually a little bit of a pet kind of like ambition of mine to introduce creatives to open source, as well as software engineers and other people from the tech community. So thanks for demonstrating how that can be used. Have a great evening, and thank you, Colin.
Thank you, James. And that is the last thank you we're going to do, or we're going to get very tired of it. A little bit of housekeeping. We have toilets, apparently. I believe they're over there. We have fire exits. I don't know where they are. Okay, they're over there. Fantastic. Apparently, there's no planned fire alarm, so if there is a fire alarm, we now know where the exits are. And for the people online, you probably know where your front door is. That's absolutely fine. And don't panic. We're also interested in your feedback. You'll see the place is littered with QR codes, because QR codes are really in these days. So there's a survey on there. As I said, we're really interested in your feedback around what we can do to make this event better. So please do fill that in when you have the time. Our next event, already looking forward to the future, the open source meetups, we run them in a number of different cities within the UK. At the moment, we're running them within Bristol, Leeds, Edinburgh, and London, and we're just starting to ramp things up again. Our next event, which is in approximately 3 months' time, will be in Edinburgh, and that's actually a picture I took myself from Arthur's Seat. Lovely view of the city. Fantastic. Hopefully see some of you there. Finally, now this is a little bit cheesy, but please bear with me. I've been to a number of conferences on my own, and it can be a bit of a scary prospect when you enter a room and there's a bunch of people that you automatically assume everyone knows everyone else, but you are the only person that doesn't know other people in the room. So I've seen already that there have been people talking to each other, which is fantastic. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, look left and right. If there's someone you haven't spoken to, yeah, you might have to shimmy along. If there's someone you haven't spoken to, say hi and ask them what interests them about open source, because open source is a very broad topic. There are a great many areas of interest. So I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes, and if I don't see you doing it, I'm going to come round and force you to. So please, you've got 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll get back to you.
Immediately afterwards, so that's okay. Yes, it's first it's nice to kind of have you on. Yeah, I guess you will. So I literally have no memory of my own too. It would be really awkward to ask you what you do because I shouldn't really know. So it's great to meet you in advance. I've done maybe 60 or 70 in my kind of 3 years and things. In the best way, right? So you come out with something and then you celebrate it. Yeah, so you're starting in... I've done some of those things like taking a schema and generating data. I guess it's also been best time to be on there. Normally, kitchens, quite big sweet station, but also humans were like enticing people to come back into the office. Fairly close to you're going to be in the office like lunch, wouldn't you imagine? I mean, so I live in Harvard, so
Hi everyone. Hello. I'm giving everyone an A star for fantastic ice breaking. I'd say the ice is well and truly broken. We're also on Discord for our online friends, breaking the ice there as well. So yeah, thanks very much for doing that. I really do think that's important. So first up we have Tim and John who are going to be speaking about Apache Pulsar. So most of you are probably aware that a significant amount of the infrastructure that we build upon these days is open source, whether it's Kubernetes, Kafka, or, the list is never ending. Apache Pulsar is another really quite important open source project that provides the infrastructure that runs the code that we write. So I'm going to pass over to our friends at StreamNative who are going to be telling us a little bit more about Apache Pulsar, the project itself, but also what it means to build a company on top of an open source project. So over to you guys.
Thanks, Colin.
So, hi everybody, just checking you can see and hear me. And Tim, do you just want to do a quick sound check?
Check, check, check. Mic check.
Everyone in the room can hear, and just checking at the back. Are we being all recorded? Phew. You would not believe how much complexity went into this this setup and getting all of this. Okay, I need to hold it closer. So I'm going to try to press the button on this to advance a slide, and not this, and mute myself whilst we're talking. And I've already managed to lose the actual... 1 second. Right, hurrah. I think we're off. And we've got about 20 minutes. We'll try and go quickly. Obviously a lot to get through tonight. And thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's great to be here. Hello guys, gals, non-binary pals, old friends, new friends. I used to work here, so it really feels like coming home for me. As Colin said, we're here from StreamNative. We're going to be talking about Apache Pulsar. Just to introduce ourselves first, you'll see I'm joined by Tim, who's over in the States right now. Couldn't be here in person. But Tim, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm the developer advocate at StreamNative. I cover what I call the flippin' stack, Apache Flink, Apache Pulsar, NiFi, different ways of using different open source and streaming technologies together, trying to give people some help there.
And I'm John. So my background is with startups, scale-ups, different technology stacks, originally in telecoms, digital media, and then cloud enterprise software solutions. Been working there for about 25 years. So I said used to be at Scott Logic. I'm now at the company StreamNative, and my role is sales. So I'm growing our organization across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So really pleased to be here to talk with you today. So we thought we would give a general overview of some of the concepts behind Apache Pulsar. We realize it's quite a mixed audience today. Some people are very technical, some people know a lot about what we do. Some other people will not have come across this before, so we'll try and keep it a mixture of levels. We'll then talk a bit more specifically about Apache Pulsar. And because this is a Finos partnership, we thought it'd be really good to talk about fintech and financial services and how that can be useful. Then, as Colin said, we'll focus on why we chose a commercial open source software route as a company, because many companies go down a classic proprietary commercial route. We thought we would be different in the way that we approach it, and that has benefits and challenges, which we'll talk about. We've got some resources to share. Sadly, we couldn't get the swag here. There is some amazing swag at the table, but we do have online materials, which I'm sure you'll find very useful if you're interested and want to follow those up. Because it's quite tight on time, I'm sure you may have questions. We'd love to talk about them, but if you want to either submit your questions online or hold on to them to the Q&A at the end, and then we'll rattle through as much as possible. We'll be here all evening, so happy to talk after our chat as well, if that's okay. So, Tim, over to you.
Okay, so what are we talking about when we're talking about Pulsar? One major component is messaging, and that means a lot of different things. A lot of them are listed here. A common thing is you want to have an event comes into your system. It could be a transaction. It could be a log, database entry, lots of different things. They happen asynchronously everywhere, and these just get triggered into some messaging system. You want to be able to consume those messages with whatever code you have, whatever system. You don't want to be tied to one language or one protocol. So that's a common use of messaging. You have more messages than you can handle, so they have to queue up. They need to go somewhere special. You know, a message comes in, we need to send it to the right place at the right time. You might just want to be able to stack up events, applications, or triggers so you can work on things. That's a work queue. And then JP Morgan Chase had developed AMQP as a great way to do high-speed financial messaging, and we support that within Pulsar as well. Data streaming is a little different from messaging. There's a lot of semantics there, and some people will use them interchangeably, but there is some differences. Ideally, they're used to do real-time processing or whatever means real time in a business sense. In financial, sometimes we're talking, you know, if someone moves a radar dish, it's no longer real time. A little more in the sub-second than the sub-millisecond here. Event happens, we process it. I want to be able to take different streams of data, put them together, do with something like SQL, which most people know. Try to find anomalies in data event streams as they happen. You know, a log comes in, a mobile app produces some data. I want to know right away someone's card is stolen, something unusual is happening. I don't want to wait a minute. I don't want to wait at the end of the day, wait for a batch. As something happens, I want to be able to know right away, maybe apply machine learning. I may have very specific ordering constraints. Things have to arrive in the order they were created or based on some kind of time stamp, or they might have to exactly arrive. If I put in 5 messages, I better get those 5. And it's just going constantly. It's not something I could start, stop. It just keeps going. Data just keeps flowing through the system. When might I do one or the other? Depends. If you need to do historical and real-time data, that's usually streaming. Pub sub model. You can have event streams from a lot of different things because you may have It maybe the data is coming from every server you have. Could be 1,000. Could come from every mobile device, every app you have on a desktop. Lots of different people producing data. Lots of people consuming it to use it, and have them be distinct and asynchronous from each other. So there's nothing tying you to one or the other. And you want to be able to produce and process lots of data. I mean, we're talking petabytes of data, could be millions of messages, and you want to do that and be able to scale up and down without any kind of difficulties or issues, or having to build out new servers every time someone adds another million transactions. There's a number of places in the industry where we see this happening more apparently than others. Certainly today, everybody is being affected by more data, whether it's from logs, sensors, just everything produces a lot of data now. But these three areas have been key in what we see where people really need something like Pulsar, banking, because you're starting to get all these different systems that have built up over decades, maybe from mergers, maybe from moving some apps to the cloud, some to different data centers. So you got to combine all those different streams of data, and they might be in different protocols, all different versions, all different languages, getting them all together in one place real time. That's a big need in banking. IoT, like I mentioned, sensors. Everybody has sensors, whether it's coming off of some little teeny device or it's coming off of 10,000 ATMs, lots of data coming in a stream, usually with timestamps on them. This is a big use case for Pulsar that we're seeing. Insurance, again, that fraud detection comes up a lot. Being able to integrate different systems and being able to just do things faster as it happens. Event happens, there's a car accident. I get that information in a system somewhere. As that's produced, I could start doing all the work that's required, make sure it gets distributed to every partner system, every data bank, every database that needs it, get it to them as fast as possible. Apache Pulsar, there are some buzzwords in there, but cloud native is the way we're designed, with a separation of compute and storage, runs natively on Kubernetes as everything must, and it's designed to be a complete event streaming platform, not just a little piece. What's nice with Pulsar is we put those two big concepts together. Most people now have work queues that might be in RabbitMQ, they could be in SQS, you could be using some legacy JMS systems, you might have a bunch of different messaging systems. We could do all those type of use cases within Apache Pulsar. As well, on the other side, we could do all the streaming ones, which you might be doing with everybody's favorite Kafka or Kinesis, or maybe some proprietary similar thing or some different variation of that. And we support the native Kafka protocol if you don't want to have to rewrite any of your applications. This is my nice chart. There's a lot of things going on. Unfortunately, when you unify messaging and streaming, there's a lot of things going on. But what it comes down to is I can get a lot of different protocols in and out, which means I don't have to rewrite code. I don't have to pick one language or another. I could do Python or Java or Go or C# or C++ or Node.js, or I could just do it with WebSockets in a web page. Could do MQTT. Any of these protocols, don't have to rewrite things. Once data gets into our topics, it doesn't matter where it's going to. It's all treated the same. It can be stored forever in your infinite cloud tiered storage, and lots of different tools to work with it. We work with all the other mainstream open source projects. Lots of cool benefits besides what we mentioned before. That tiered storage, so you don't have to worry about what happens if I get 100 petabytes. I don't want to pay for expensive SSDs. Just it'll automatically go into S3 and have no difference to you on how you work with it. Very resilient because that separation of compute and storage, each layer scales out independently. Everything's asynchronous. You don't have to worry about things being too tied down if a node goes down. Easy to build real-time apps. And what's nice is built-in ability to build and support microservices, which is a nice way to build applications. You want me to do this one? You doing this one?
I thought you were doing this one, but
I can do this one. There's a lot of people using it, and they're all cool. So
yeah, we're going to individually just walk through each and every one of them. No, we're not. So yeah, so thanks, Tim. So when we look at the features and benefits of Pulsar, what we find is that they're a really good match for financial services, fintech applications. So if we hone in on a few of these areas, so the need for large data volumes, if you think about transactions, financial transactions flowing between different components within your system, you need high scalability, which Pulsar provides. Also, the event messaging capability, where you have topics, we have producers and consumers of data. We appreciate we've not got into a deep dive of this architecture, but fundamentally, this allows a very distributed system to be easily developed and have the information that you need reliably be sent to the different components within your application. Financial services is also very demanding as an application space, particularly around the need for low latency. Obviously, if you've got financial transactions, that's something that requires a very short timescale for delivery of the messages. You need geo-replication, so you have high availability, resilience of your data. So Pulsar naturally supports multiple zones, multiple availability zones, multiple regions, multi-cloud strategy. Your data integrity, when you're sending information as messages, you need to make sure that they arrive in order, and if you need them to be processed exactly once, that's guaranteed by the platform. And durability, as Tim was talking about, the way in which storage is just seamlessly managed by Pulsar means as a developer and an architect, you don't need to worry about how that's going to be managed. It's just there when you need it. And of course, for financial services applications, that's essential. And lastly, multi-tenancy. Often, in financial services applications, you may have a complex data model that requires different customers to have access to different parts of data, or role-based access control, or row-level security, or different ways in which you partition all the information. And again, that's part of the features and benefits of Pulsar. So put all that together, the kind of applications that are commonly seen in financial services, you will have multiple consumers of your data, so your transaction information. You may have payment processing that flows through to different parts of your system. You may need alerts. You may have analytics. You may want to be able to just build onto your system ways in which you can examine what's happening. And KYC, know your customer, in this increasingly broken and fragmented world we sadly live in, there's more and more regulations, compliance checks, restrictions being applied that need to be built into a system that's handling financial transactions. And lastly, fraud detection, analytics, machine learning and AI. Again, you can design your application so that just the parts of the information you need get sent out to the consumers of that data. I would like to talk about some of the banks that are using Pulsar today, but I can't name them because we're under non-disclosure agreements with them. But they are a growing number of banks, financial services, insurance sector companies, insurtech and fintechs, using Pulsar as the fabric for these reasons we've just been discussing. So that was a technical side. So if you weren't enjoying that technical part, you can breathe a sigh of relief. We're going to talk now about why open source and why we chose that route as a commercial company. So to answer that question, we need to go back to the heady days of the mid-teens, pre-COVID, which feels like a lifetime ago. So our founders, CJ, Matteo, Ja, they were previously working at Twitter and at Yahoo, and they were running some of the biggest Apache Pulsar and Apache Bookkeeper clusters at the organization. And they created this framework. And they realized that in order for this to really survive, it would benefit from being released into the open source community. And at that time, Yahoo was famously releasing a lot of components through to the Apache Software Foundation. It was a natural choice for the software framework at that time. So that required a bit of a leap of faith. They had to place some bets and make some decisions that would be the basis of the company going forward. And they assumed that they would get some benefits from an open source model, some of the things that we've been talking about. So not least, they were hoping that other companies, individuals would contribute to development of the code base. I'm pleased to say we have over 500 active contributors to Apache Pulsar currently. Also, you get the benefits of security, many developers reviewing, analyzing, improving the code. You're not limited by who works for your company. Code escrow, if StreamNative as the creators or Yahoo then, if we went out of business, suddenly not available. If companies are using Pulsar, they still have access to the source code, and that gives longevity. So for this system which they had developed, that was very appealing. Also, the founders strongly believed in the importance of keeping the core features within the open source free version. So you may see some open source frameworks where there's a core which has most but not all of the features you need. But with Pulsar, right from the beginning, we were clear that we wanted to keep everything in the free version. But that meant that in order for it to be viable as a business, we had to find commercial offerings around that, which would be a services-based model initially. So I'll talk about that next. So as a commercial open source software company, as opposed to free and open source software, there are a number of benefits and challenges. So the benefits we've just been talking about of having many developers contributing to the code base, that's certainly been the case. So I'm speaking now as obviously someone who's newer to StreamNative, and I'm seeing that in terms of how our product is evolving. We also have had the benefits of security, longevity, escrow. That is something which is quite reassuring for our customers, that they know if they choose to use Apache Pulsar, that they get these benefits. The challenges, and so this is where I put my coin-operated salesperson hat on, is very much, well, if it's free, why and how would you get people to pay for it? It's free software. And there's been a number of reasons why they have done that. And essentially, the benefit has been that we offer peace of mind, because the solutions that we are selling, that people buy from us, pay for, are the commercial hosting. So whether it's a managed service on their cloud or our cloud, whether we're providing consultancy services, helping answer questions, they know that if they come to us, they're going to be able to deploy, manage, run complex Apache Pulsar clusters, base their business on it, and it'll be a reliable service. And as the creators of Apache Pulsar, who better to come to than StreamNative? The other aspect why people may pay is that sometimes free is perceived as low value or no value, which is a curious one. But for larger organizations, if they're going to make a decision to use it as their foundation, this really matters. And so they want to know that there's a commercial relationship, a procurement team, a legal team, service level agreements, all of that support. That does factor around the way in which we sell our services. Another challenge has been managing multiple roadmaps. So most commercial companies with closed source proprietary products, you have your own product roadmap where you've just got to think about the competing needs of your customers or what you might do in the future or what's going to bring in revenue sooner. That's normal. But for us, we are managing remotely. Oh, I should clarify that we don't own a StreamNative. We don't own the Apache Pulsar code base. The PMC, the Project Management Committee within the Apache Software Foundations, they own it. So we contribute along with other people to what happens with that software stack. So that means for us, we are thinking about if we're going to enhance it, do we go through the open source route, or would it be something which we may want to build some commercial tooling around our product in the services space? So that adds a little bit of complexity to our offering. So I'll hand back to Tim. I think we can talk about resources and come on to some questions, but Tim.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of cool stuff available. And as an open source company, we make as much of it free and easy to use. The Academy is free training. They'll let you spin up a free Dockerized environment to try out Pulsar with a bunch of different languages, whether it's Java, Python, Go, and some other ones. And also we've got a number of videos to walk you through the basics of, you know, what we didn't get to do in a couple of minutes here. You can see a full hour or look through all our other videos where you can see different companies talking about, you know, what they've done with Pulsar. And we got an awesome free book. My colleague David wrote this. He's been involved in the Pulsar community for a number of years. This is a very full book. You get the full PDF of the book. It is a very in-depth book. If you go through this whole thing, you will be an expert and ready to do whatever you need to do in Pulsar. Nice book to have. And we are definitely open for discussing anything about Pulsar. You can hit me at any of these links. GitHub's always a good place. I have a lot of code there for people to check out, examples, demos, those sort of things.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tim. And thank you, everyone. I think we just did it in 20 minutes, so that was remarkable. It worked.
Great job, yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, that'd be great. Any questions? Oh, Andrew. I could have guessed it would be Andrew. Go on. What's your question?
So obviously it's different than Kafka. Could you give is there one selling point, one thing where you go, think about this is different for Kafka because...
Yeah. Can I just reiterate? I know the people listening online probably can't hear that. So the question is, I know it's different from Kafka, but what's the kind of pithy single sentence that differentiates?
So I'm going to refer to Tim on this because when we were preparing our Q&A, so what's going to come up? And my first question, I thought, someone's going to ask, what's the difference between Pulsar and Kafka? So if this was QI, you would get the klaxon now, Andrew, with asking that question. So Tim, did you have that was one?
The built-in open source geo-replication. It just features that you expect to have in someone who saw what happened before in Kafka and needed some other things, like support for AMQP, support for MQTT, support for RocketMQ, support for the Kafka protocols natively. So you could do whatever you did in Kafka plus more with a cleaner design.
That was slightly more than one sentence, but I think it was a good answer. Any other questions at the back? I think the question was, how resource intensive is it to use a cluster with Apache Pulsar? How much does it cost? Yeah.
And so, Tim, yeah, the question there was how much does it cost, and also the overall kind of complexity footprint, I guess. We should definitely talk after this session to go into. We're delighted to talk about the money. I mean, the kind of the short answer is this is obviously complex. If you look at the way in which cloud software systems, if you go to AWS and try and figure out how AWS charges for its software elements, I'm sure, like all of us, we were scratching our heads thinking, gosh, that's quite difficult looking at, compute and ingress and egress and charges and availability zones. So we try to be simple with that. And like I said, and I'm trying to be careful to separate, what StreamNative does is offer that cloud hosting, cloud managed service, and we support. But ultimately, if you want to use Apache Pulsar and focusing on the open source aspect of it, you're free to do that at no charge whatsoever. And then, of course, it's a scaling question, sizing question about how to configure and dimension your system. And if you need help with that, then sure, we can help with that. And what we find is that, like I said earlier, people come to us for peace of mind in that we can just manage it for them. So that's the kind of very small plug for StreamNative. But the Apache Pulsar framework itself is brilliant. And I would encourage anyone who's curious about it to try it, and we can provide free trials or just give it a go. I think Paul's got a question.
I think what we'll do is leave that for a question from Discord. Oh, fantastic! Oh, yay!
What are they looking for from the community in terms of contributions to the source code?
Yeah, sorry. Oh, it's on my one as well. Bit of a lag. Yeah. What are you looking for from the community in terms of contributions to the source code?
Tim, do you want to take that? Because this is, I think, a really good...
Yeah, this is a better one for me. I mean, we have a lot of committers, but everyone needs more. We're especially looking for people who want to look at some of the old requests people have out there. And for people who aren't coding, who want to help, there's always need for documentation, demos, articles, people testing things, looking at the latest versions. If you use an exotic language or are looking for a connector, we can always use more connectors written. If you see something that's not there, we are very happy to have someone put in the code for a new connector. Maybe you have a different database you're using we don't have yet. Maybe you just want to find look for bugs. Maybe you have some things you want to add to the C# client. Whatever you're doing, there's probably some way you can help. I mean, always looking for help. It's a pretty nice geographically spread out community. Just contact me if you have any specific skills or interest, and we could try to match you up in the right place. We have a pretty good Slack channel for that.
Cool, thanks very much. And it was interesting there, a reference to non-code contributions, which after the break we'll be having a couple of talks about the non-code side of open source. So once again, thanks to you both. Excellent talk. I'm going to try to speak, and actually, could you do me a favor? Can you plug this one in? I'm sure there's a smoother way of doing this. One of the things I wanted to do between some of the talks is share some of the things that I've read, listened to, or thought about in the past couple of weeks in open source. Yeah, it'll wake up. No, wrong way. There we go. So I just wanted to share a few things that you might be interested in. I'd recommend looking them up when you get home. So the first one I want to share is a podcast I'd not heard about, the Sustain OSS podcast. Errol's actually one of the co-presenters. It's absolutely fantastic. It's been running for a couple of years and has a whole host of different presenters, open source maintainers, commercial open source investors, all sorts of different people. But fundamentally what they're talking about is the sustainability of open source from a great many different perspectives. I'd thoroughly recommend subscribing to that podcast. Alex, do you want to... Oh yeah, you're next. Fantastic. Sorry, I should have given him a little bit more warning because he's on crutches, so I'll speak very, very slowly. Actually, do you want a hand with your getting your laptop up and running?
Should I just, I've got a memory stick, should I put it in the Mac?
Well, I'll tell you, it's probably easier to just set yours up. You can tell how smooth we are. I don't suppose you could do us a big favour and just open that up. And yeah. So while Alex is getting ready, I'll briefly sort of introduce him. One of the things I really like about open source is how big an environment it is. The first talk we had was about commercial open source, a business built on top of open source, which is a significant part of open source. But for me, another significant part of it is playing around and hacking. And by hacking, I mean hacking as in the way people described hacking in the 1970s. You know, people who are curious, people who want to look under the covers, find out how things work, break it, fix it, change it. So Alex is going to be doing a talk about some of the fun stuff that he does in his spare time in the world of open source, specifically talking about WebAssembly and fluid dynamics. Cool subjects. How's it going, Alex?
Yeah, just booting up the old computer.
Sleep mode might have been better. I'm glad Windows computers don't take 2 minutes to boot up now, but we'll see. Booting up the computer and fixing the mouse? Yeah.
Okay, so do I need to join the Zoom?
No, you're good to go once you're up and running here.
Oh, I see. So everything that goes there goes out.
Yes, that's right. Sorry. We really should have had a rehearsal.
Yeah.
Looks like we're almost there. Excellent. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah. Oh, you have a clicker, right? I can use that instead of the mouse. Okay. All right. So I'm Alex Birch. I work here at Scott Logic,
and this is one of my personal projects. So my background, I did a lot of game development as a kid, and in terms of open source, when I see things that inspire me, I like to make my own version. I like to make things better, and this is a story of one such project. So I'll show you the game I was trying to make, and I'll then show how that relates to open source, like the project I made and shared, so that you can make games like it. Where's the mouse cursor? Okay, so I think I'll skip that. Keyboard. Okay, so did anyone here play Mario Galaxy? This isn't the game I made, someone else made that in Japan. So I really like this idea of a platformer that was physics-based, and that gravity didn't just go down, it went everywhere. So I tried to make my own one in 2D. So first I tried doing it with maths, with vector projection. You just work out which direction you want to point. That has trouble with concave surfaces, and it still doesn't solve the problem of how about inertia, how about collision reaction. You can solve the problem of how do you go between planets if you instead calculate gravity and inverse square and then sum them. But again, still no collision, still no inertia. You can slap some paint on it, but there's problems. So this is with like kind of fake collision detection reaction. You just look at the pixels and then there's no bouncing, there's no anything. So it is very limited physicality. So how about we get a physics engine? Did anyone here play any of these games? Yeah, so there's Tiny Wings, Angry Birds, Cut the Rope, Rolando, Shovel Knight. All of these games are famous uses of the Box2D physics engine, which is open source, zlib licensed and now MIT licensed. And Box2D is already on the web. It was so that was my first try using Box2D.js. The problem with Box2D.js is it's a bit out of date. It adapts Box2D, the physics engine, as of 2014, but it misses out on all of the 2020 updates. It misses out on rope physics. So that was my attempt to simulate rope physics like a decade ago. It's not ready for the modern web because there's 1,500 functions and it doesn't tell you what they are. You need TypeScript bindings if you want to use Box2D. So can we modernize this? I'd like the latest Box2D and I'd like TypeScript declarations. So first of all, Box2D is written in C++. It'll have classes like this one. So that's how vectors work. You've got floating point numbers. You've got x and y. It's got methods. That's written in C++. How do we invoke this from JavaScript? So you compile it to WebAssembly, which is on the right. You've got assembly instructions. So you have a function named vector2set. It has 3 parameters actually, because the first one is a pointer to the instance of the vector that you constructed. And then you've got x and y, they're floating point numbers. It's a virtual register machine. Is that correct, Colin? Stack-based virtual machine. Okay. So you put on the stack the pointer to the object and y, and it will store it 4 bytes away from where the object starts. And then you put then again you put the pointer to the object on your stack and x, and you store it at where the object starts. So that's what it looks like when you compile the C++ to WebAssembly. Now the question is, how do we invoke that from JavaScript? What is the calling convention? So we like to use the C application binary interface. Everyone's agreed this is a great foreign function interface. So you have this bridge. You have this glue code where if you want to invoke the C++ method set, you would create a C function vector2 set, you would take a pointer to the object instance and all the parameters, and you would forward the call to the C++ function. This visibility modifier tells the linker not to get rid of unused code and to make it a public symbol. So we're going to need to make 1,500 of these. Let's say we compiled that program back there, and we wanted to invoke it from JavaScript. What would that code look like? You've got your WebAssembly, you compiled it with Clang or Emscripten, and you download the WASM bytecode, it's already parsed, you execute it, and you pluck out all of the symbols, the public symbols that are exported from it. You've got the method that you exposed, and you've got the memory, which is just a long line of zeros. And then you say, at 0 in memory, I want to invoke that function. That 0 is my vector. I want you to throw some 1s onto it. X and Y will be 1 and 1. And then, again from JavaScript, we can get a floating point view over the heap. We say, show me the first and second floating point numbers on our heap. And they'll be X and Y. So this is a very, very manual way to invoke C++ from JavaScript. How do we scale this up? And you notice there, this was not type safe. There was no documentation. How did we know this method existed? Well, we remembered that we put it there. That's not good enough. So now, TypeScript declarations. So we do an unsafe cast. We say that the program you've executed will not be just a boring old WebAssembly source. It'll be a subclass of source. It'll have a subclass of instance, and the exports will be subclass of exports. And we will say, you can expect to find this method on that WebAssembly instance. How do we do 1,500 of these? So we need a language specification for saying what functions exist. So we use WebIDL. This is a format for declaring bindings. Our C++ class on the left can be bound to by this WebIDL description of it. We say there will be a class named vector2. It'll have a public no-args constructor. It'll have 2 floating point attributes and 1 void method. And Emscripten's WebIDL binder will take this description and produce that glue code that we made earlier, that C implementation for us. So this can be auto-generated now. We also get the constructor, for example. By the way, this isn't a very good constructor. New seed control of how is memory allocated. So it uses dlmalloc if you're using Emscripten, but if you wanted to say, I want to use a small block allocator, you could use placement new. You'd have to write your own binder for that. So, okay, so Emscripten can create that C interface for us. Can it create the JavaScript for us? Yes, and in fact, if we wanted a really idiomatic JavaScript interface, we would use classes. We wouldn't use a bunch of loose methods. We wouldn't ask you to pass a pointer in. So, if we wanted to construct a JavaScript vector, we would do it like this. This is a fun thing. So, how do we do those attributes? We said, okay, so I'm in JavaScript. I want to construct an instance of a vector. When that happens, it will use, it will invoke that vector2 constructor that was exported via WebAssembly. It'll allocate memory for it, and a pointer will be returned. This will be hidden and remembered by our class. If we want to invoke, if we want to expose to our JavaScript callers a set method, we can invoke WebAssembly set on our pointer. It's a private property, but we've remembered it, and pass the x and y to WebAssembly. The attributes are fun, because we don't even need a method at all to look those up on the WebAssembly heap. We can use maths. We can use pointer arithmetic. We can say we know the vector starts at the pointer that we were given, and we know that x is the first floating point number there, and y is the floating point number after it. We just add 1 to the pointer. So that would be the very fastest way to provide attribute getters in JavaScript, just direct heap lookup. But you could also make mscripton actually generates functions for these, and I think it doesn't make a difference at the end of the day. The JIT will inline them across language boundaries, so you'll get the same result either way. So we were able to make the C glue code with from the WebIDL description. We were able to make the JavaScript abstraction from WebIDL. Can we make TypeScript declarations from WebIDL? Yes. So that JavaScript class we made, you can just as easily imagine a TypeScript class. The important part is this, but there's the details of how do you pull this out of an mscripton factory. There's a promise and everything. Let's focus on how do we programmatically make one of these. This mscripton does not give you for free. It's the first thing that our toolchain doesn't give us. So I had to invent a way to do this for Box2D WASM, my WebAssembly project. So if you go on, there's a website, TypeScript AST Viewer, where you can type in arbitrary TypeScript, such as declare module Box2D WASM, and the website will tell you how would you use the TypeScript compiler API to generate that same TypeScript program. So declare module, create module declaration. Export class, create class declaration. It'll tell you what to type into your program to make that program. You may have noticed TypeScript is just a Node.js library, and you can say import TypeScript, and it has a bunch of functions for making TypeScript programs. So now that we know we can use TypeScript to make TypeScript, let's parse that WebIDL declaration using an off-the-shelf WebIDL parser. Let's iterate through every AST node, and emit TypeScript classes using the TypeScript compiler APIs. The important thing is we make an array of TypeScript statements. And 1,500 bindings later, you get something like this. So compared to the earlier experiments I was showing you, we have collision detection and reaction. We have gravity calculated. We actually have curved gravity. So you use a Bezier curve, you work out the closest point, and you create inertia towards it. We've got fighting gravity sources. So two spheres, they each exert their own gravity. We sum it. And we have priority gravity. So if you want to transition from curved gravity to line gravity, we have a precedence list. This is how it's implemented in Mario Galaxy, and I did that in 2D as well. You can slap some paint on it, and it looks like this. The sprites aren't aligned perfectly, so it doesn't. The video is longer than that. Whatever. So the next chapter is after we got parity with the original Box2D.js project. What happens next? Fluid simulation. So this is where the kind of open source story starts. People hear about your project and they want to use it in different ways. They have different ideas for it. Someone, Dan Brickley, who works at Google Open Source, asked, hey, could you do exactly the same thing for Liquid Fun? Liquid Fun is a Google fork of Box2D that adds fluid simulation and soft body dynamics to Box2D. And so you check out the project, Liquid Fun, what happened with it? And there are people asking why there are no more releases of this thing. Since 2014, it's been abandoned. And they say, we ran out of time, it's too hard. Why is it too hard? Because in 2013, when they began the project, they forked from old Box2D. They created an SVN repository. They put everything into a different folder. They used a different style of line ending. And because they're on old Box2D, all the file names are different, everything's in different folders, the license is different. Liquid Fun used different data types. They put all the source in a different folder. Everything about these repositories was irreconcilably diverged. So, if there's 6 years of Box2D updates in mainline Box2D that you want to give back to Liquid Fun, how do you salvage that? 1 week later, I'd rebased the Liquid Fun project onto mainline Box2D, and I'd run it through all my WebAssembly stuff so that we have WebAssembly and TypeScript bindings. And one person was happy. And now we have... this is where I want to use the Mac. Right. And now we have fluids. And that's only the start, really. So other people are also using the project, and they're like, I actually have a game in production that uses a Box2D game engine. I'd like to switch to your WebAssembly version to make it faster. The reason I was... So he wasn't using Box2D.js. He was using like Box2D TS. There was like a TypeScript native port. It wasn't performant, but it had TypeScript. This was the first way to get performance and TypeScript declarations. So, and he's gone to production, and you may recognize he implemented a feature from Getting Over It, the PC game. And it was really nice to see my game engine used to make something I'd heard of or something that's big. It actually helped someone. And in particular, this homage feature, the guy in a cauldron using a hammer to navigate a world. The way he told me about this was he opened an issue asking, how do I get access to private properties of prismatic joints? No explanation. And like, if you help with that, you enable people to make cool parodies like this. And as a game developer, he told me more things that can be done with the game engine. He said, he said he's heard of this kind of stuff before, and what people usually did with Liquid Fun was render all those dots as water. They join the fluid using OpenGL shaders, and having never done graphics programming before, I had no idea what was involved in that. But like he as a game developer had good relationship with, I think, Cocos 2D. So he was able to explain how to get the graphics to look like water. These videos played better on the Mac. So, and he drew my attention to Google's presentation of Liquid Fun, where they had an eye candy demo where they drew really good water. and there's another shader. Yeah. So the left one is it uses information from time. You store store a few frames of buffer and refer to them when you draw your next graphic. And the right one is it doesn't do that. So because that was OpenGL and there's a WebGL standard, you're able to more or less without changes copy that OpenGL code and just throw it into a web page. And this was kind of the culmination. This demo I made combined all of these techniques and used fluid, used orbital physics, and used rendered water. That's actually... Oh yeah, there's only one more thing left. There's performance. How do we make a performant demo? How do you go 60 frames per second without dropping any frames? How do you get rid of stuttering? Oh, there's actually, I did the other shader as well, didn't I? So you can... Yeah, so that's a temporal blend. It remembers like a second of stuff it's drawn and blends it. So how do we make a fast demo? So to draw graphics at 60 frames per second, you have to compute a time step every 16 milliseconds, and the physics takes 5 milliseconds unless your computer's overheating, which it is. So that gives you about 10 milliseconds, 11 to draw all the physics that you've calculated. It takes less than 1 millisecond to send the vertex buffers to the GPU, and I don't know how long the GPU takes to draw it, but drawing can be fast. But your main enemy here is the garbage collector. If there is a large GC pause, then you lose JavaScript execution for a few milliseconds is absolutely enough to cause stuttering, and that will impact your physics calculations if you're saying physics time and render time are the same thing. So how do you stop garbage collection? You stop creating garbage. Avoid heap allocation. If you need a structure, reuse it. Don't make objects, don't make arrays, don't new, and don't use functional programming. I think at this point you're saying, well, hang on, that's not JavaScript anymore. Yes? We have they've given us some nice techniques like typed arrays that allow... Cause JavaScript arrays, they're associative arrays, they're dictionaries, they're sparse in memory, except for optimizations, like small one. If you want guarantees about is it just going to be a line of memory, use a typed array. And like numbers in JavaScript are like double precision floating point numbers. What if you actually want loads of bytes close together to be integers? Again, you typed arrays. And draw everything via WebGL, so that you can. I mean, the graphics card is much faster drawing 1,000 things than your CPU is. Your graphics card has thousands of stream processors. And that's everything. Any questions?
That was brilliant. I'm just going to point out one thing. How do you rebase 6 years of code 1 week later? Alex definitely is a hacker. Any questions for Alex? I've got one, of course. So you mentioned you're fighting garbage collector. So you're using WebAssembly for your physics engine, and WebAssembly doesn't have a garbage collector. So I'm assuming the garbage collection is within your sort of model universe. Have you considered doing the modeling in WebAssembly and then basically just pushing buffers straight into WebGL? You know, effectively getting rid of JavaScript.
No. Yeah, actually, assembly script would have been a really good way to do all of the parsing vertex buffers to WebGL. That's a good idea.
Yeah, I expect to see it next week. Any other questions? You're all suitably baffled. I think it was a fantastic talk. Thanks a lot, Alex. I'll move to one side to let you move past. Right, so I've just got one thing before we move on to the break. I really wish we had got our AV a little bit more smooth. As I said, I'm sharing a few things that I've read, seen, thought about in the past couple of weeks, and this one is a little bit sad. I'm guessing we all know that there's some pretty horrific things going on in the world around us. I'm talking about Ukraine and Russia, and it affects everything. And it was really brought to my attention just how much of an impact there is. Just the other week, a friend of mine sent me a new open source project that he was working on, and I started looking at some of the code and helping him out. And one of the building blocks that he'd used was the Electron Builder boilerplate. And he'd not looked at it for a few months. He was happily relying on it. We were both shocked to find that one of the most important building blocks in his project has now been archived because the developer behind it is in Ukraine, and for obvious reasons his mind is no longer on the open source project. And as I started looking around, there are more and more open source projects effectively being shelved and disappeared as a result of the conflict. And I know there are much bigger impacts to the conflict, loss of human life, but it's amazing and shocking to see the waves that are fanning out in all parts of our life, including open source. And it does make you think, what should we be doing about it? And people are already reacting. One of the things you might have heard of is there was an open source project that injected code that wiped file systems on Russian computers. So this is effectively a supply chain attack targeted at Russia, which I can understand the motivation. However, I would point you to this blog post on the weaponization of source code. What seems like a reasonable sort of retaliation, when you think about it, has some pretty damaging side effects. And what this author pointed out is that open source is very much built on trust. If you're a large commercial organization, you can afford to scan your full software supply chain and you can ensure that it's secure. When I install stuff on my machine, when Alex goes home and starts working on the assembly script version based on my idea, he will just go ahead and he'll install stuff on his machine. The reason he does that is because he trusts the open source community. So weaponization of open source is not the solution because it shakes the very foundations of open source itself. What the solution is? Good question. We have a break. We have 15 minutes. I'd urge you to have a think about that. Thank you very much. 9, 8, 3, 2. Leave the pizza. I can see you. Leave the pizza for me. Okay, thanks everyone. We'll get started once again. So, as I mentioned previously, we've got a couple of talks coming up next, which are not all about the code, which is a great, reflection of the breadth of open source. So, with that, I'm going to introduce Tarek, who's going to be talking about the human side of open source projects. And by the human side, it's human beings that make open source projects exist. And to create a thriving open source project, you have to attract other human beings to participate, which I think is a fantastic subject for a talk. So hopefully, if the technology is on our side, Tarek will be good to go.
Fantastic. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Fantastic. So just remind me how long I've got so I don't overstay my welcome. Is it 15 minutes?
I'm sure 15 minutes is fine.
Fantastic. Brilliant. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully that will also work. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. Is anyone able to give that permission to me? Thank you. Yep, that now allows me to do it. Great. So you should all be seeing a big blue screen, hopefully. Right, so what I want to do today is really to get us to think a little bit more broadly about the creation of open source, the use of open source, and think a little bit about how we can encourage more users to use open source and more users to contribute to it. Because 15 minutes isn't that long, I'm going to be giving some examples or slightly sort of tongue-in-cheek sort of pictures, just to try and kind of get the message to stick, as it were. I know it's the end of a long day, so I won't do a very kind of dry talk. I'll try and do something that's a little bit more kind of jovial and animated, but there's a serious message underneath that. Why do I feel like I can offer some thoughts around this? Well, I guess I've been using open source since around probably 1995, maybe a little bit earlier than that. So I've been around the block a little bit. And in that time, I've seen what works and what hasn't worked. I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I have picked up some kind of life experience. I currently run an algorithmic art group. It's got 4,000 members. Currently paused because of the COVID thing. I run Data Science Cornwall. I run a kids code club. I'm the author of a few books, which is very much enabled thanks to open source. Without open source, I wouldn't be able to do that. In fact, I wouldn't even have a career. So open source has been really transformational. I've worked in government as well, playing a role as trying to kind of remove some of the barriers to the adoption of open source in government. This was around sort of 5 to 10 years ago with GDS and so on, and trying to kind of break the kind of the monopoly, as it were, of some of the big corporations around government tech. And my sort of silly claim to fame is that around 95, 96, 97, I think I installed the first Linux workstation in the British civil nuclear sector. I was told I was the first to make that claim myself, so it goes back some way. Just some pictures of some of the things that I run, and the reason I'm showing you this is just to sort of say I have spoken to people and worked with people, young and old, and the young ones are particularly interesting users to learn from. People who are sort of kids who are 7 to about 14. If you can make open source work for them, if you can make technology work for them, then you've cracked, I'd say, 80% of the problem. Before I do dive in, I do recognize that there are different kinds of open source projects. The small ones, which are personal projects, and I have no right to sort of tell you how you should run your project or what you should do, but you might choose to take on board some of the things I say. Small means you don't have a lot of resources. I can't, telling you to spend lots of money in order to improve the access to your project isn't really going to work. And then we have medium-sized projects and very large ones, which have a lot of resources, quite often kind of funds that are organized through charities and foundations, and they have a little bit more luxury in terms of thinking about how to remove the barriers to participation. So what I'm going to do is, in a slightly random way, I'm going to go through just a series of 5 observations, and some of them will sound really obvious to you, some of them might not. And I hope they're just sort of food for thought. So it struck me, actually, as I was thinking the other day, that over the last sort of, I don't know how many years it's been, open source is fantastic. It's a huge amount of talent, huge amount of energy, lots of people working, giving their own time. And that's something that no other sector has that amount, and that's great. But there is a bias, there is a kind of dominance by an enthusiasm for technology. Lots of people in it are enthused by, whether it's JavaScript or whether it's the BSD kernel or whether it's network protocols. A lot of it is about tech, and that gives the feel of the community a very tech-flavored feel. But it also colors some of the software we produce. It's very much dominated by our desire to be interested in and explore and play with and build things from a technology perspective. And it means that other valid interests and concerns perhaps are squeezed out a little bit or don't get a chance. So, perhaps the software that comes out of the open source community doesn't have quite the influence of people who care about users and user needs and design and user experience. Of course, there are examples where a good job is done there, but I'm kind of looking at the whole kind of landscape, and I think most people would agree that there is a definite coloration towards tech versus some of the other fields. This is the first of one of my many silly examples I'm going to give today. So this is just the other day, on Twitter, as some of us are, and I saw somebody asking how do you take a screenshot and save it to a file automatically? And one of the many replies was referencing something called Pillow, which I think is a Python or it's an imaging library, and referring to a function. So you can create a script that runs in the background, and so on. And you think, well, you can see here the enthusiasm for the tech and finding intricate, interesting ways of solving a problem versus something which should be really simple. Just take a screenshot and save it to a file. So this to me struck out as, wow, how far have we got from solving an easy problem in an easy way? So that kind of highlighted to me, actually, there is an over-dominance of tech and perhaps not enough representation of ease of use and simplicity. This isn't real statistics, this is just something I've made up, but I would like to see a continuing shift, and it has already started, of the open source community being made up of not just technologists and software developers, but people with different kinds of skills, people who are interested in understanding users, doing user research, interviewing users, working and testing software with users, people who are content designers, content creators in terms of creating documentation and tutorials, guides, design for software that faces humans that we use. It is evident that some software, as useful and technically capable as it is not intuitive at all. And I really like the mantra that I think Steve Jobs invented, which was, if it needs a manual, you've done something wrong. Now, I know that's not applicable totally, but it's an aspiration I think that we should aim for. And people who are good at organizing communities, working with communities, encouraging people to take part, breaking down some of the barriers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I think the open source community should have a higher representation of those other kinds of skills. And content and design is not just writing. It can be about graphics, it can be about visual design, it can be about music, it can be other kinds of creative skills as well. Here's an interesting journey. So this is me pretending that I've, actually, let me check, yeah. So the second observation was getting started is too hard. And this is an illustration here. So I'll get this little short 30-second video going. So I'm imagining that I bought a computer, it's got an AMD GPU, and I want to use it to accelerate my machine learning. So I type AMD machine learning on the web, and it takes me to this website, top of the list. And I can't understand it. It doesn't seem to say to me, well, this is what is ROCm? It doesn't actually say what ROCm is. It doesn't tell me how I can use it. It doesn't tell me what it does. I'm kind of struggling to look around the website. Maybe it's in this section. Nope. It tells me about TensorFlow. Am I open? Am I VisionX? Oh, it takes me to something on GitHub. I don't understand what that is. So I could carry on with that video in my search for getting started with an open source machine learning library for AMD. But that example I've just given you shows that actually, if I wanted to get started, there's an unnecessary barrier there. The website, which is the primary entrance to that world, hasn't helped me. It's sure, it looks well designed in terms of it's very slick. You can tell effort's gone into it. But the simple question of how do we make it easy for newcomers to find out what ROCm is, and how do we get them started with perhaps examples, or even just putting 3 bullet points on the webpage saying, this is what it is, this is what it does. Yes, that is an isolated example, but it's not that isolated. There are lots of other examples out there where just thinking about the perspective of a new user who wants to get started with your software, does your website help them, or does it throw them straight into a GitHub tree? So the third observation is related to that, not just getting started, but getting help. And unfortunately, fortunately, there is, the open source community is very generous. I would say, the vast majority of it's very, very kind of friendly and approachable. And we have meetups and conferences, and people want others to share and kind of take part. And that is good. But there is a minority that's very significant, unfortunately, which makes it hard for newcomers. And you've seen some of this toxicity around, calling people noobs and not helping people when they ask questions on Stack Overflow, and throwing RTFM at them and pointing to them at, So for many people who are getting started, it might surprise you, but not everyone knows what a GitHub issue is. Even the name isn't really giving it away. Telling people to do a pull request, that's not very helpful. So I think we need to be conscious of how we treat people who are new into the community, new into the use of our software, and remember that we, some of us or some of you in the audience might be very well knowledgeable and very well very intelligent about learning new things. A lot of people haven't had that luck, and need a little bit of support, and need a little bit of friendliness. And if that friendliness isn't there, people will get turned off and run away. I've been tempted to give up on things in the past just because of a few idiots. A fourth observation is focusing on what we've already said around design. I think in my professional life over the last 20-something years, I've really realized, I've come to the conclusion, and not just myself, that you can have great technology, really cool techniques, great computer science, great algorithms, all the cool stuff going on. But if it's not usable, then it's not useful. To make things usable, we have to think about designing the whole round, understand who our users are, design for them, think about the content, the language we use on our web pages, in our software, think about the visual design. Are we overloading it? Is it intuitive? Are we minimizing the cognitive load? Just because you've created the software and you know what every button does, when a newcomer comes to your software, are they overloaded with a deluge of scary looking buttons that they might be afraid to touch? So design is really important, and thinking about what the users want to do. Those of you who are practiced and well versed in kind of agile, iterative, user-centered development know this, but not everyone does, and there's still a lot of software out there which clearly hasn't had design as a thought or even an afterthought. So a silly example, but in the number of times people, friends, humans, non-techies, civilians have said, I'd like to edit some images, or I'd like something to crop things, or just simple things. And the standard answer from the open source world was, there's more choice now, but it was the GIMP. But that in itself scares people away. Now, we can chuckle at it and call it the GNU image manipulation program, or whatever it's called. But something as trivial sounding as the name can scare people away. And I would honestly say we've scared a whole generation of people away just because of that name. And you can chuckle, but that's if we really care about reducing barriers to the use of our software, these are the kinds of things you have to think about. What does our software appear like? What are the vibes it gives off? Here's another little thing that has bugged me actually, and it's about making software intuitive, making software so that it has a low cognitive load, so it doesn't surprise you. Now this is a silly example. It's a JavaScript puzzle thing, but there's a list of 3 numbers in an array or a list. I'm not a Java expert, and it sorts it, and you have to guess which one is output. And you might think, is a trick 0 indexing and 1 indexing? But actually it's not. What happens here is that it sorts according to alphanumeric rather than numeric. And that's a surprise, and that's not, that's bad language design. So we have to think again about, yes, we can design software to function and behave in ways which might make sense to us, but we should check ourselves and say, well, what would be unsurprising? What would be intuitive? What would feel like a slow slope for normal people, for new entrants to use our software? There are good examples. I think more and more people are now starting to think about design. I know here, for example, is Firefox from the Mozilla kind of foundation, and increasingly they are looking at how people are using the browser. You can see here heat maps showing which buttons people press. Are we asking the question? Are we overloading the interface with buttons that people are afraid to click or scare them away? Everything that's on the screen becomes additive to the cognitive load. We don't want to do that. So the top left shows the results of a survey of what people do and don't press, and then the result was a redesigned interface where the buttons and the elements that are most used are more prominent, and things that aren't are hidden away. I'm not sure exactly the detail of this exercise, but we should be doing more of that. We should be monitoring how people use our software and testing, what confuses people. How often do we do that? We might, look at the list of issues on the GitHub, but how often do we actually talk to users and say, how did you find it? What surprised you? What was the thing that you thought, if only they'd explained it that way? So that kind of insight is really, really important. And as I said, I'll keep saying it, you have to balance the technology with usability. Otherwise, one without the other, there's no, you lose the value of it. Now, the long-standing perennial argument about this is the year we'll have Linux on the desktop. But related to that is the question of Microsoft Office versus LibreOffice and so on. And from I think it's a missed opportunity. Most people when they are surveyed, and I haven't dug out the surveys. There's not enough of them. Most people just want to do the basic stuff: print, bold, underline, center, insert image, maybe a table, export as PDF. So why on earth do we throw all this stuff at them in an interface? Scares people. You think something's going to go wrong, and I'm talking about not technical experts. I'm talking about the vast majority of people who we want to be using open source home software like LibreOffice. So rather than trying to mimic Microsoft, and that's just there because it has an established monopoly, this is an opportunity to say, well, let's redesign this. Let's think about what do most people want to do. What are the top 5 user journeys? Design our interface for that. And sure, reveal the complex stuff for other users, but 80% of our users just want to do bold, underline, insert image. So that's the kind of thinking I think we should be doing more of. Here's potentially a good example. The point I'm trying to make here is make sure your software makes it easy to do the easy, common stuff. So 2-minute software that I've grappled with over the years, you have to bounce through quite a lot just to get it to do the core thing that it was designed to do. The approach should be, what are the top 3, 4, 5 things this software is going to be used to do? Let's make them easy. Then everything else requires configuration and options. So on the left is some complicated code so the task is simple. There's data about items, things which are either related or not related to each other. Let's visualize that as a graph. So the code on the left is using some Python library for building a network, a graph thing, and then visualizing it. And actually the code goes off the screen. But you ask yourself, hang on, all I want to do is take a bunch of data, columns of what's related to what. Let's make that assumption. If the assumption is broken, we can then go into configuration options and stuff. But most people will have data in that format. Let's just make it really easy to do the thing that everyone wants to do, which is visualize it. So there's a different software which I think does a better job. You import the library, you have your data there, you check that it's right by visualizing it, and there's just one function call to say show it, and that's what it does. It shows the data. Now, of course, you can do a lot more with. There are more options. There are more kind of things you might want to do, but those are not the 80% of things that people want to do. So I think that example is done well. Make it easy to do the most common or easiest thing, and push your configuration and your complexity to the other use cases. Shall I blow my own trumpet? Yeah, I wrote that. You can Google it afterwards. I think the other thing around not just users, but people who create and are part of the kind of making of software, that community, and users, I think I've observed over the years that sometimes the communities can become very narrow or very exclusive or very elite, and ultimately they are at risk of dying out. Communities which are the kind of the foundation of software fizzle out, or they kind of go into a hole. And I've kind of realized, and this is my final point, is that it's really important to have a constant flow into your community. So in this pyramid, the pyramid shows those people who are experts. They're the gurus. And if you just have events and meetups and documentation or whatever you do aimed at those top people, then they're going to die out. That's not going to grow. What you need to think about is establishing and maintaining a flow through that pyramid so that you cater to intermediates. But to create intermediates, you need to cater to beginners. So for every expert, there might be 100 or 1,000 intermediates. For every one of those, there might be 100,000 beginners. So it's really important. And as I say, I've run, and I still run, 3-4 meetup groups. I used to co-run the London Python meetup group, and we doubled its size and activity by making this change, by doing more beginner-friendly events, by messaging and making it clear that Beginners are welcome. Nobody's going to feel stupid or left out or kind of, scared. Because then you have people coming in, because everyone has to start at the beginning. So you have this flow. So I just want to signal to people here who might run groups, just be wary of, just focusing at the top of the pyramid. Make sure you have that flow. So coming to a conclusion in a way. So for small projects, people's personal projects, clearly you can't spend a lot of money and resources on this issue, but just make sure your web page is helpful. Tell people what it is. Put a tutorial, a guide, or an example on there. Example of your code and use. It's amazing how much software doesn't do that, and that's a barrier that takes people away straight away. If you've grown a little bit, if you can dedicate more time, think about how you've designed your software. What's the function of the API? And think about things like, let's make the easy thing easy to do, or let's make the most common thing easy to do. The shape of your software and how it interfaces is important. We've seen so many examples over the years, over the past, where that wasn't a consideration at all. As you become a bigger project with more resources, you can invest in more engagement. People like videos. People search. The young people, especially, first thing to do is to solve a problem is not go to Stack Overflow, but go to YouTube. That's growing. So more and more people are doing that. So think about creating videos about introducing the software, showing its use, and that really resonates with people. It's what people want to see. They don't want to read if they can avoid it. Show worked examples, run tutorials, run workshops, have an organized help if this is where you can afford to do that. So not just people putting things on an issues list. Engage in social media, talk to people, find out what they're thinking, how they're using your software. And if you are one of the very large projects with lots of funding, then you really, really should be focusing a lot more on user research, testing, making sure that your software is optimally designed, thinking about content design for showing what your software does, its documentation, thinking about the visual design. The best software out there, particularly from the commercial world, they understand that each degradation of, say, a user experience or a complicated UE is a fraction of users that are not going to be your customers. Think about community outreach, inclusion, because different skills, you want them part of the community. As I said at the start, we need to change that pie chart to be not dominated by technologists. We need other people involved. And at the moment, a lot of technology meetups don't give the vibe of being welcoming to people who are musicians or content designers or visual artists. We need to kind of move in the direction of changing that and that flow. Make sure there's always a steady flow of newcomers and income. Just otherwise you'll kind of die out and turn into a rabbit hole of expertise. The final thing, if you only take one thing away from this talk, is just put yourself in the shoes of people you might be wanting to reach, whether it's a young, new developer or even old tech-shy developer, somebody you think should be contributing to your software, or a user out there who's just found searching on the internet for something that might help solve their problem. Put yourself in their shoes. That's the only thing I'd ask. Great. I will stop there. I probably have gone over my time. I didn't see the clock, but I hope that was audible. I hope it gave you something to think about after you leave today.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear the applause from your end. Yeah, thumbs up.
Thank you. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, I think it's a real eye opener. We do concentrate so much on the code and the developers, and there is so much more to open source than just that. Any questions on that talk from anyone? We don't have a question. We have a disagreement. Wow, this is exciting.
That's the wrong mentality.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to paraphrase that entire sort of comment. It was a counterpoint to making things easy that if you don't understand what a pull request is, I guess there's an onus on you to actually go and learn what a pull request is, and some things require complexity. I'm not sure that was a question. That was more of an observation, which is fine.
Thanks for repeating the question. Nothing that I've said is mandated, of course, but I think you'll find that those communities that make it easier to help people and don't tell them to go away and RTFM or find out what a pull request is or whatever it is, they will do better. If there are communities that don't do that, they might sustain, but they're always in danger of being superseded by friendly communities. So I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm not going to say do what I say, but I would just point out that it's the more friendly and open and welcoming groups that will stand a stronger chance of succeeding.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Tariq. I'll
Fantastic.
transfer. Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.
I'll do my slightly clumsy transfer computer while talking into microphone thing. We'll do this better next time. So, as I said, I want to share a few things to read, think about, and the one I'm going to share next is actually something that one of my colleagues wrote just a few weeks ago. So, open source has made it so easy to consume, whether you use NPM, pip, cargo, whatever language you use. There's a very easy way to just grab stuff off the internet, which is awesome. However, sometimes when you take a few steps back and look at your project and you go, wow, my project is now 1,000 projects created by 10,000 people that I don't know. And that's great, but when you're building something for a user, they look at you. They don't look at the 10,000 other people and the 1,000 other projects behind you. You have a very real responsibility to your users that your software does what you say it does. So it's something that you really should be considering is it's not just things like security and licensing, it's how maintainable is it, and sometimes it's, do I actually need this thing that I just added, or am I just adding it because I'm a bit lazy or because it's a bit cool? So this is a really good blog post. It goes through a whole load of things that you should really be thinking about before just downloading the whole internet onto your machine. So we're on to our final talk, and again, this is another one talking about some of the other aspects of open source. Errol's going to be talking about how designers collaborate, and all I'm going to say is, I must admit I know very little about this subject, so I'm really looking forward to hearing more. And then I shall clumsily transfer the computer again. And try not to trip you up with the microphone.
The first thing about welcoming designers is you don't tell them to go read the fucking manual. You say, hello, welcome. What do you want to do in our project? So anyway, I have strong feelings about that. Right. How do I get this over here? Which way do I need this to go? Oh gosh. 2 seconds. So the first thing that I actually wanted to show you all is response to Tariq's. The organisation I work for has created this lovely dev's guide to user testing and doing lots of things to do with users. So please go take a look. I will drop the link in the Discord. It was funded by Internews, and they are doing a lot of really great things about making tool teams for open source have access to resources. So you can find things like scripts for how to conduct user tests and lots of other ways of recruiting users and all those kinds of lovely things. The other thing is that, it's also on a repo, so if you want to suggest new things, you can go in here and add an issue, if you know what that is. Read the manual if you don't. But you can ask for things that aren't there and what you want to see. So talk to us and tell us what you want from designers to help you out. And the other thing is, if you don't know where designers are and you want to ask them for help, opensourcedesign.net, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, we have a jobs board, but it's not just paid stuff, but it's gratis stuff. So if you want to ask a designer to help contribute, this is one of the best places to go. and then come and join us on our lovely discourse forum where we talk about stuff. Right, okay, for the talk. So that was like a little preamble. So it's quite late. So I'm going to try and be as quick as I can. So this is going to go into a specific project that I worked on when I was at Ushahidi, and I'll talk a little bit about Ushahidi as an open source organization, but this is about the design contributions to open source software and the learnings that we had from the Open Design Project. But this is me. I've been doing stuff for 12 years in design and user experience. I've been doing stuff in the humanitarian and third sector and human rights sector about 9 years. I've been doing stuff in open source software, or FLOSS, or however you want to call the acronym, for about 5 years, and I'm also doing a PhD about it. That's cool, interesting, in computer science, up in Newcastle, researching how designers get involved with open source, and specifically humanitarian and human rights related open source. I call myself a human rights centered designer, which is another talk for another time. I currently work at an organization called Simply Secure. We mostly work on tools to do with open technology, human rights, security and privacy, high-risk people doing stuff with technology around the world, maybe in places where they're not supposed to do those kinds of things with technology, like talking about oppressive governments or other things like that. So we work on a lot of those kinds of tools and a lot of non-profits. But this talk and the content from it is from when I worked at Ushahidi. Some of you might be familiar with Ushahidi, maybe not, but I'll talk about their open source tools. So Ushahidi is a Kenyan tech NGO that make open source tools. The first one that they made, the example on the left-hand side of the screen, is the open source platform for data collection. And this was made in 2007, 2008, when Kenya was having its very first democratic elections. And essentially what was happening around the country was not a lot of good stuff, in the sense that people were being stopped from voting, some violence, lots of other things. And the founders of Ushahidi wanted to create a free and open tool for citizens to talk about what was happening in different locations. It's done through SMS, and lots of other data collection methods have been included in new versions. But essentially what it was it allowed anonymous submission of information from citizens about what was happening locally on the ground, and that helped the world know about what was happening there, and that was all done through open source tools. It's also been used since that time for crisis response. So the example is when the earthquake happened in Nepal, it was used to map what was happening in those spaces, like where the devastation had hit the most. And the Nepalese army used that information, that open source crowdsourced information, to deploy aid to those spaces. So that's Ushahidi, and that's where I worked as a designer for several years. And the other one, other tool on the screen at the moment is 10.4. Ushahidi doesn't really support this one anymore. But it was a aggregated crisis communication tool that was open source. So the idea, it was after a terrorist attack in Kenya, we created this tool because we had staff members in one of the malls and we couldn't get in contact with them. So we created this open source aggregation tool to send out multiple communication methods to find out whether everyone was okay. So that's what Ushahidi does. And in 2018 or 2019, which I'll go into in a little bit, we started to, Ushahidi's always had designers involved in the process, or at least more recently had designers involved in the process of their creation of their tools. But when I joined in 2018, after a little bit of getting settled within the open source space, I started to wonder, and I looked at all the contributions from developers coming in on the code base, and I was like, why aren't designers doing the same thing? I'm a designer, I'm in open source. Why aren't there the same thing happening for people like me, and why is that? So I asked this question, I asked my colleague as well. I worked with one other designer in Ushahidi at the time. And we sort of were really curious about this question. We started to ask our developers, we said, why doesn't this happen? Does this happen? And they were like, we're not quite sure. So we worked with a design agency called Designit, which is not open source, but they are very good. And in 2018 and 2019, we piloted with them some design jams or hackathons that were centered around the 10.4 communication tool, the open source communication tool, to really try and understand, would designers show up to a hackathon which is about contributing to an open source software tool? What could we learn about how to structure that kind of event for designers? Because typically you go along to a hackathon as a designer and you kind of stand around for a bit and go, I can do UI stuff maybe, icons, graphics, anyone? You maybe are useful, you're maybe not. But most of the time people don't quite know what to do with you at hackathons. Especially if you're in that place where you're entering very new and you need a friendly community of which to welcome you into what you can do. Because often you don't know the possibilities. You show up, you want to help, but you're not quite sure where you fit in best. So we piloted these events. They were hugely successful in the sense that people came and people did stuff and made contributions. Great, successful in actual issues and PRs as well. There is a video that I can share, and I'll share in the Discord so you can have a look at how that was supported. It was supported by Designit and Adobe at the time, and Ushahidi. And the biggest thing that we found out was most designers didn't quite, or a lot of designers don't quite know what open source is, but they understand what it means to contribute to something for good. And they want to contribute to things that do good. And there's a huge amount of designers that want to do this. They want to use their skills, contribute their skills, volunteer their skills towards something good. And that doesn't necessarily always have to mean non-profit good or like charity good, but sometimes the way that we would frame this in the events is that the critical infrastructure of open source upholds the internet, the open web, and therefore you're contributing to good because the open web is good. And once you explain it in that way, people get it, right? And designers are welcomed. So after this first series of events, these hackathons, we created the Open Design Project. We couldn't name it. It's hard to name branding. It's always hard. So we called it Open Design because it kind of says what we wanted to do. And the first part of Open Design was about trying to investigate more deeply the question about why aren't there more designers in open source and why doesn't this happen more? So we were successful in getting some funding from Adobe, which, everyone can have opinions about if you want. Adobe, I'll take their money, thank you very much, if it's going towards the designers in open source, and not use their proprietary tools. So anyway. But yeah, we did a lot of investigation in the first part to really understand what the challenges were and how we could frame this and carry this through and continue this kind of work. We did a whole heap of that, and you can find all of that research on the repository, the historic repository, which is on Ushahidi, which I've got a link for a little bit later. But essentially, what we wanted Open Design to do is, we framed it in this way, so designers collaborating and contributing to humanitarian open source software and tech for good at challenge gatherings. So we used different kinds of terminology in order to make it more accessible and friendly, so ways that designers could understand what they were contributing to. And let's go into some of the challenges. Now, I don't think I've got a great amount of time to go into depth in all of these challenges, but I'll do my best. So most designers, not all designers, some designers are actually coming from a tech background and kind of transition from coding into design. You actually find a lot of the open source design.net designers have come from a coding background and transitioned into design roles. But most designers really don't have a clue about what open source software is or can be. And that's the critical part, is the can be. So when speaking to designers and other roles, so not just designers, we had a lot of product managers, a lot of writers, a lot of creatives generally, coming along to these events that we wanted to create because they felt like it was a place for them. They felt like they could come along and that there was something that they could do there that isn't the typical kind of hackathon-like description. And they were really surprised about the diversity of projects. So we didn't just talk about the Ushahidi projects, which are reasonably understandable within the context of contributing to something for good. It's very obviously an NGO, very obviously humanitarian purpose. But when we had them there, we talked about all the different kind of infrastructure that Ushahidi was built on, the coding languages that it was built on, and the nature of open source and the different things that they could then contribute to. We then talked about all the different things that they might have touched as designers, all the different tools, services, the web that they never knew was open source. And we sort of began to open them to this world. And they were very, very grateful. And it's much more accessible once you frame it in this way. The second challenge, I'm just going to get some water, is that open source software isn't part of design education. So something that really surprised me when I was in industry, like when I was working in proprietary or just regular software companies, was how much open source software is kind of pervasive within the education system of becoming a coder, or a developer or someone working with code, whether or not you go traditional, I guess, like university, or whether you self-teach. Open source is something that you will use, learn about, touch in some way. Whereas in design education, it's largely completely absent, and even if you are using open tools, they aren't explained as open tools and open source. The nature of them isn't explained within design education, even if you're using the technologies, which is part of the problem. So designers just don't get taught these kinds of things unless they seek it out, or unless a friendly person helps them seek it out and teaches them. This is changing, though. A couple of years ago, Darmstadt University in Germany have a whole module in one of their design courses, which is all about using open source tech for designers. So things are changing, which is super cool. Oh, connected to this, which is, I can't go into much depth about this, is one of the things that is great for developers with open source is that it can become part of your CV. It becomes part of how you show your skills. And because designers aren't taught about in education, and it's not valued as part of their development process, if you're then going into job interviews and saying, hey, look at all these open source design interviews, look at all these open source projects I'm contributing to, the design managers are like, what? So the whole system of how open source needs to go into the design space really does need to be cyclical, because if we're teaching it, it then also needs to be taught to the organizations that then value it as something that is hireable. So anyway. Okay. So even if they know about open source software, or they've learned about it from these events, GitHub, absolutely a barrier. GitHub, GitLab, terminal, all these things, creating and deploying the local instance of a software on an open source software on your machine, absolutely a barrier. Loads of designers want to contribute, but they can't because they actually have to, do a Docker instance of this to actually see what it does if it's got a GUI, which often they don't, but you're not exempt from design because we've done design support for pip and terminal things, so don't think that you're exempt from needing design help if you just do terminal work. But yeah, it's absolutely a barrier. So they don't know what the interface does, they don't know the terminology, and they need friendly people to come and help where they can fit in. There's also a lot of infrastructure on GitHub and GitLab that doesn't yet support the kinds of workflows that designers have. So, you can drop a static image or even a video link into a lot of issue comments, and like prototype links, but a lot of this isn't really supported within these systems, and therefore it's not valued. Yeah. Okay, so this one. Take a moment to read it. Most open source projects that we talk to and that I've experienced and contributed to tens of open source projects myself and mentored many, many designers contributing to other open source projects. They understand design as logos and graphics or GUI, and it's not always that. So just like Tarek was saying, it's not just about the UI, it's not just about the visual things that designers can help with and designers add value to. It's about really understanding what you're trying to do, who you're trying to serve, and whether or not you actually know who you're trying to serve. Because as soon as your open source project has one more user, one more clone, one more fork, it's not just for you. You're not just building a software for you. You're building it for you and one other person, and then another set of people, and then another set of people. And you will absolutely not know exactly what all those people need until you do user research, which designers can help with, and we're very happy to. Oh, this one. So one of the big things that I needed to do in the second round of workshops, which I'll talk a little bit about, is project issues. I know that there's a lot of advice out there on how to write really good issues, and I'm not suggesting that any of you in this room write bad issues, though maybe you do. But maybe you don't write accessible issues. So maybe you don't write issues that everybody can understand and everybody can contribute to. And the project issues within even our repositories at Ushahidi, when we were wanting designers to contribute, were really restrictive. So they were really focused in on the technology side of things, not about like how to actually solve a problem, essentially. And often when designers began to understood what the issues were trying to describe that they wanted, they often said, well, have you thought about this? Oh, that's another issue. Have you thought about this? There's another issue to create. So one of the things that designers were doing with these issues was kind of breaking out of the restrictive nature and kind of really helping to understand the wider problem that a particular issue might be addressing. So they were asking questions kind of like, oh, what was this one? So an example might be design a form capture for new volunteers that includes name, email, and address. So this was a real issue in 10.4, our open source tool. And what that issue is doing is largely dictating what they think they want. They want form capture for this, this, and this. And it leaves very little room for exploration for what actually the users want to do and need to do and why. So the kinds of questions that designers were asking were, why is this form needed? What's it trying to do? Why those data points specifically? How should this be stored? Where should this be stored? Why should this be stored? What are you going to do with it? So it's all those kinds of questions about the contextual information around the issue. So designers in particular do need this context in order to better understand what the problem is going to be. And you might think that there are issues that don't ever need any design help, but if you introduce them to a designer, I'm sure that they'll have some questions about the issue. But the alternative to that is that when we did the first set of workshops, we went in with very broad challenges. And those, from the design perspective, really lacked focus and relevancy. So when you offer, like, say to a designer, in this hackathon workshop situation, you say, well, we have a tool that does this, and we'd like to explore how to make improvements over here. Then designers tend to create design work and questions that are not necessarily grounded in the reality of like the current technology functions, or maybe the restrictions that are to do with the technology, or maybe even within the scope. So that they'll start to create things which we call in the design space design fiction, or vaporware, really, in a lot of ways. So they'll start to design things which are technically unfeasible. So like voice-activated things when you haven't got the capability to have voice input for certain tools and things like that. So you really need to strike a balance between very restrictive issues and very open explorative issues. So, what did we do? Once we did all this information gathering, all of these different challenges, and there are more challenges in the research I didn't go into, we wanted to trial our new framework for different design workshops and interventions. And we took all of this different framework, which is on the open repository, and we took them to 2 different places. We took them to Bangalore in India and Taipei in Taiwan, to 2 conferences that were, one was a design conference specifically, and the other was an open source conference with the design aspect, to see which one, whether, designers came to a design conference more, or whether they came to an open source conference more. They equally came to both, turns out, if you invite them within the spaces where they're welcomed, they come. And the reason that we chose these 2 spaces is contextual to the open source tool that we were doing the hackathon for, so the 10.4 crisis communication tool. So this is one of the other things that's really important, which could be easily missed in this, which is when you're speaking to designers or wanting designers to contribute to your tool, making sure that they are within the context, or that the context is close by, is really, really useful. So we made sure that we wanted to go to places that have experienced crises, disasters, and Bangalore had just had a series of devastating floods in the southwest, or nearby Bangalore in Kerala. And Taiwan had had some terrible typhoons. So what we were able to do was make it grounded in the reality of what had been happening there. So when you're thinking about your open source software projects, think about where the physical environmental realities are happening, like where, if it's something to do with schools, makes sense to do it in schools. So think about the context, think about the space. I got some lovely photos of designers doing design things at these hackathons. Lots of post-its. Don't skimp on the post-its if you're engaging with designers about open source. And we structured these workshops, and you can find all of this on the repository. But we structured these workshops around different design activities, because the audience was primarily designers, although we did get a few developers come into the design activities and hackathons, which was really, really fun. But we structured them around 5 different activities. The first was empathy mapping, which is really understanding your users. Second was defining the problems. So this was taking one of the issues that we had converted into design language, and they were defining the problem. We did an ideation exercise. We did storyboarding for the ideation that the teams had chose, and then we did sketching and prototyping, all within the kind of, I think we did full day workshops. So this is in sort of 8 hours-ish. And a lot of these activities inbuilt in these was a lot of team cohesion, because we recognized, being in open source for as long as we had, that part of open source and making open source successful is feeling part of a team, whether that's a team across borders digitally through your computer screen, or a team that you're sat at a table. The idea of community cohesion helps contribution. So a lot of these activities were there to help the groups really solidify and get cohesive with their contributions. And they created a lot of prototypes, which they submitted in issues to the specific issues that they were responding to. So they were encouraged to produce these prototypes. And then these were the first iteration of prototypes, and the idea was that we'd have second rounds and further rounds of prototypes to refine the purpose of them. They also had feedback sessions with users, which I'll go on to in a moment, for these prototypes. And the intention was to take them through a series of user testing with our actual users to make sure that they were indeed solving the problem that they were intending to solve. So I want to talk a little bit about the things that we discovered are really important after these 2 other workshops that we did. So I mentioned earlier that there's a balance to creating those issues and creating design challenges. And I did a lot of work in translating issues into design challenges and making sure that there was that bridge of communication that worked really, really well between the 2 different functions. And there's an example, which again I can pop in the Discord. And yeah, the main thing with these translation from issues into design challenges was not trying to offer the solution and not thinking that you have all the answers and that, oh, it just needs to do this and look like this and function like this. It was about, we think that it could function like this, but what it really needs to do is achieve this, this, and this, because there might be alternatives around designing a different solution that maybe you hadn't thought about. Describing the problem is really important within these design challenges. It also helps them to develop an understanding about what you want to do with the tool overall, or what you want to do with your software overall. Cool. The other one, which I've touched on already, is being location specific. So because open source is relatively new to designers as well, our processes and communities really aren't structured or socialized very well, and not the same as developer communities really at the moment. So as well as the location being specific and important to the purpose of the tool, it was also really important for it to be location specific and good for that kind of sense of community, so that designers didn't think that they were one designer trying to do it all by themselves, that they had a community around them and they had the support. Often designers that don't contribute in a group scenario are like solo designers trying to go into a project absolutely by themselves and kind of really have a rough time and then bounce out and typically come back to the open source design.net community and kind of say, I tried to contribute this design, but I got, chewed up and spat out. So what do I do now? And then they come back to the community and we say, well, maybe try this way, or maybe try explaining it this way. So we wanted to build that kind of sense of community within this location and making sure that they had a support network. Cool. And then the last one, which is really important, especially for the kind of tools that we were creating, the humanitarian and human rights tool, making sure that you invite users, humans. We called them witnesses because of their relevancy to crisis. So we didn't want to kind of other them by calling them a user. Sorry, I can't turn off my Discord noise. So we called them witnesses and we gave them a brief. So we invited them explicitly, paid them for their time as well, since they had been experienced crisis in this scenario and often lost a lot of income or other things. And what they were there to do was give that extra context about what their perspective was about using the open source or being a part of that open source. So in these contexts, they were the kinds of people sending in crisis communications using the tool, not a tool modifying or contributing to the tool, but they were using it in certain ways and needing to deploy it. So it was super critical within this context to make sure that they were well heard. They also did feedback rounds. So after the prototypes were created, we invited them back to tell the design teams, hey, yeah, we think that this works in this way, but have you considered this? So it was really critical and so good for both the designers and the open source project to really have the people that were contextually using things part of the process. And you can do this digitally. This doesn't have to be in person. Like, this can totally be facilitated just in your sort of online repository space as well. So I've gone over time. But the ideas of open design and open source design are essentially to increase and sustain contribution, to support the design community, to build understanding between design and open source software, which is really critical. We don't often understand each other and we don't speak each other's language very well. So we do really need to make an effort to understand each other. And bringing open design to education and workplaces so that we can have it valued at all those different stages. But that was all stuff that was in 2018 and 2019. So what's happened since then? There's been a few years. I mean, there's been pandemics, but anyway. Lots of stuff has happened. So I did a workshop with developers and maintainers at Open Source 101. I did a full-day workshop about how to welcome and invite designers into the process. So how to write a contributing design .md for your repository, how to make good first issues for designers explicitly, how to make sure that there is that space for them. I did a workshop with designers at UX Bristol. What is open source? How can you search on GitHub for a project that you want to find and contribute to? How do you become welcome in this space? How do you speak the language? Kind of trying to do that process of condensing the manual into a workshop for designers. So it's delivered by somebody that they kind of have a connection to. I speak their language. I did a workshop with human rights activists, technologists at RightsCon. Loads of talks about this, similar to this one. Lots of mentoring of designers and developing internship schemes with open source design, talking to Outreachy and Google Summer of Code about what it's like to introduce designers into those kinds of schemes, because you can do it, and it does work. Maintaining the open source design community, it's a labor of love. Fundraising, we got our first grant approved from the Vermont Complex Systems Center for capturing designers' stories of how they contribute to open source. Designers don't really document and talk about how they do this process, and we need more of that. And it needs to be funded. And yeah, doing my PhD, which is hard. So, it's all there as a methodology to use. It's all the different documents are there, all the structures are there. If you want to run a design workshop for your open source tools or your projects, take a look there. There's the historic repo, which is still on the Ushahidi organization, or is the one that I'm maintaining at the moment on my own personal GitHub. There's opensourcedesign.net, we're lovely. friendly. We'll talk about design with you and open source. We're talking at the moment about spending our Open Collective money on internship and fellowship schemes where we pair a designer with a developer to go into an internship, so that it's not just a designer going in solo, not just a developer going in solo, but there's a pair, there's a unit there. We think that's going to be really exciting. And Sustain podcast has a series of other podcasts. So there's the main podcast, but there's also one where we just talk to designers about open source. There's 25 episodes, so there's a lot to talk about with just design and open source. But there's also a docs podcast. There's an OSPO, if you're interested in OSPOs. Loads of podcasts. And that's me done. I've gone way over time, but thank you.
That was brilliant, thank you. Any questions from anyone? Something went bub. There could have been a question. Yeah, at the back there.
It seems to me that open source is something that software developers know how to do rather than designers don't know how to do. Are there any other communities that you think would be really able to contribute to that?
Product managers? So there's been a couple of There's a couple of there was like a few talks from product managers within open source. There's a couple of podcast episodes in the open source design, the Sustaining Open Source Design podcast about product management. But yeah, there's no community at the moment for product managers that want to get involved in open source software, and that's a really tricky thing, right? Like, how do you jump into an open source project and start, doing product management, like helping build a roadmap? Is really, really tricky because you need a time essentially to do that. So that's a community that has not really been utilized much. And then I would say there's lots, but so I mentor a designer that's contributing to open source music software, and this is kind of connected to what I would suggest anyway, but it baffles me that there's no musicians actively contributing about how they use that tool. And the designers involved in that project have really been trying to bring in those users, those humans, into like, well, actually these choirs are using this music tool, so can we listen to them? Can we receive their contributions? And I do think the other community is the people that use it that don't modify it in any way. So we often think that open source software, if we use it, we also modify it. But that's not always the case. There's lots of people that use it and don't modify it and never will. And we need to hear from them and how to make it better. Is that okay?
I think I'd throw some others into the mix. Writers, whether creative writers or technical writers, you just don't see them in open source. I think one of the things that I found really memorable in your talk actually was right back at the beginning, and that's not to say I fell asleep through the rest of it. It's just that you said something really early on that struck a chord. It was about motivation, and I think for developers and engineers, one of our main motivations is just scratching the itch. I know Alex's talk, that was about scratching a personal itch. That's why we do it. But you mentioned designers. A lot of their motivation was to do good. And so my question for you is, do designers ever just scratch that itch? Do designers go home and just design stuff for the fun of designing stuff?
They do. They often do it through the method of portfolio pieces. Okay, so designers are notorious for, and I have a lot of problems with this. I'm not well liked by either of the communities in some ways, open source or designers, because I sit in the middle. But designers will go and redesign Spotify or design Facebook for their portfolio. And what I say to them is, why don't you contribute to an open source project and have a real project to put in your portfolio? And then you get the experience of, working with a team as well. So yeah, they do it. And I also think that there are open source projects that, so the font foundries, so designers doing and font creators making fonts. That's a really good example of scratching your own itch. I love Comic Sans. It's very accessible for people with dyslexia, so it's a good font. But But yeah, there are definitely designers out there creating UI kits. A lot of the designers doing that kind of scratch your own itch are not really necessarily always doing it on places like GitHub, but they're being facilitated through things like Figma now. So Figma, even though it's not open source, has a really big open design community, and the difference between open design and open source design is that it's opening up design as opposed to design for open source, in a sense, or open sourcing your design. And so there's tons of communities using Figma to like say, oh, I created this UI system, here's the Figma file, use it. Whereas kind of what I often say to them is, you know, you could go a little bit more and, you know, kind of open source that in a different way, but they aren't quite there yet. Even though Penpot exists and everyone should be using Penpot, which is a great open source design tool. But yeah, we do, but it's hard to find if you don't know where to look.
I shall do one last clumsy handover. So yeah, final recommendation of some things that I've been doing recently is I kind of realized that I've got a short attention span. I read quite a lot of tweets. I look at Hacker News and read the first couple of paragraphs of most blog posts and then form strong opinions as a result. I realize I don't read enough books, and I've heard that reading books is actually quite good for the mind. So I've been trying to read more books recently, and interestingly in the world of open source there aren't many books, so I think by the end of the year I can probably have read them all. So a couple of recommendations. The first one on your right hand side, Working in Public by Nadia Egbal. It's a fantastic book that explores the open source ecosystem from a sort of maintainer perspective. And you actually mentioned that designers don't really know much about open source. I'd say most developers don't know much about open source, in that for a lot of them, they know it exists, they know it's on GitHub, but you ask them, where does it come from? You know, how was it formed? They're like, I don't know, it just appeared by magic. It didn't appear by magic, and this book is a great way to understand how it was actually formed. And recently, it's become an increasingly isolated space. A lot of open source projects are created by a very few individuals who then create something which is used by millions of people. Now, my other recommendation is to wind back right to the very beginning of open source, before it was even called open source. The Cathedral and the Bazaar, written by an author who was around at the time of the GNU project and Linux. I'm reading that. I've read Nadia's book. I'm onto this one now, and I'm kind of reading it as a bit of an exercise in history. Quite a lot of what was written in that book is absolutely true of the time, but it's changed a lot in the meantime. I think one of the really interesting ones is, you've probably heard of the sort of Linus Torvalds phrase that with enough eyeballs all bugs are shallow. The general notion that because we open source things, lots of people will look at it and bugs will be fixed. My one comment to that is Log4Shell, Log4j. There was a critical bug in a piece of software that almost everyone used that went unnoticed for 6 years. To my mind, that notion no longer is correct, and there are quite a few things in that book that I read them and think, that's wrong now. Doesn't mean to say that's a bad book. It's a fantastic book, but it's interesting to read something from the beginning of open source and something that's open source as of now. Now I'm going to stop waffling. So the final thing is, I'm going to say thank you. So the most important thank yous once again are to the speakers and to yourselves for coming along, and Claire is waving QR codes at me. So if you could fill out the survey, that would be great. So give yourselves a round of applause and thanks for coming along. Pizza, drinks, things like that.